And we have some more information about those very important 7th characters with traumatic injuries and other external injuries. Let's have a look. Okay, here are the more important ones. I'm going to do this a little out of sequence so it'll make more sense. We always have the initial encounter. That's where the injury first comes and is treated. So that's typically the emergency room, and the operating room within the hospital, right? So that's the initial encounter. And these can be either, we'll just talk about the A, D, and S for right now. The D is the subsequent encounter. So again, this is a follow-up medical office visit or clinic visit. And then we have the late effects or the sequela. So we need to kind of think of these things as starting off with A, initial encounter, D, follow-up or subsequent, and S, sequela. A, D, and S we see with all injuries. Now, with fractures, it gets a little bit more involved because we have different types of healing with fractures. So we can also have an initial encounter for either a closed fracture or an open fracture. We can have subsequent for encounter for routine healing. We can have delayed healing. We can have subsequent encounter for a fracture with non-union, subsequent or follow-up encounter for a fracture with malunion, and then finally something that's common to all, sequela. Let's stop and have a look at all of these, and this will kind of illustrate why we need to use the tabular. Looking at chapter 19. So let's take a look at some of these and the guidelines in the front of the chapter. Little breakdown of the different muscles, what have you. And then you will note what we just referred to, superficial injuries. This applies to this entire category. As it says here, A, D, or S. A is initial, D is subsequent, S is sequela. And when we get to the fractures, as skull fractures, code category SO2, the same types of things that we talked about. And again, pay special attention to this. You don't even have to memorize all these. They're all in the book. Here's what you do need to memorize. Anytime it says check fourth, this will be one of them. And they get more involved when we talk about laterality.